December 19th, 2006. Clayton, Missouri. 57-year-old attorney Ernie Brasier is found shot to death inside a third-floor office of his law firm. Since Ernie was killed in an office belonging to another attorney, there is speculation that he may have been the victim of mistaken identity, but no evidence is found to support this theory. Over the next few years, there are a number of strange incidents involving other employees at the firm, including a bombing at the home of two of its partners, but they fail to shed any light on Ernie's murder, and the crime remains unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and this week we're going to be covering a bizarre cold case involving an attorney, the 2006 murder of Ernie Brasier. I originally received a request to cover this case nearly 2 years ago from a listener named Alex, and while I had never heard of it before, it turned out to be quite a rabbit hole. At the time of his death, Ernie Brasier was a civil litigator and partner at Boggs Bates, a law firm that specialized in defending insurance companies in personal injury cases, and while that might not sound too dramatic, Ernie was shot to death in one of the firm's offices while working late one night. Since Ernie was a very well-liked and well-respected family man who did not appear to have any known enemies or skeletons in his closet, no one could figure out the motive for this crime. While there was speculation that he might have been a victim of mistaken identity, this was never conclusively proven, and no one reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. Ernie's widow would describe Boggs Bates as being a law firm that seemed like something out of a John Grisham novel, and that's a very apt description, since Ernie's murder was not the only unusual event surrounding it. In the years following his death, there would be a number of strange incidents involving employees at the firm, including a major falling out between its partners, as Boggs would accuse Bates of setting off a pair of pipe bombs outside their home. However, it's unclear if any of this drama is connected to Ernie's murder, but even though his family seems to have their own idea about who could have been responsible, the authorities have never named anyone as a suspect or person of interest, let alone amassed enough evidence to make an arrest. The whole story is a very wild and complicated saga, so we're definitely going to have a lot to talk about on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has nearly 90 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the murder of Ernie Brasier. Our story begins in Missouri in 2006, and our victim is 57-year-old Ernest Francis Brasier, who goes by the name Ernie. Ernie was born in Chicago, but after his family relocated to Missouri, he grew up in the unincorporated community of Robertsville. In 1974, Ernie graduated from the University of Missouri School of Law before he moved to Texas to complete Army Reserve duty at Fort Sam Houston. He then started off his career practicing immigration law in San Antonio and spent a lot of time serving clients from a poor Mexican-American community. In fact, Ernie was so devoted to helping them out that he wasn't terribly diligent about billing his clients for their services if they didn't have the money to pay him. He eventually decided to return to Missouri and currently resides in Town and Country, which is located in St. Louis County and is part of the greater St. Louis area. Ernie lives with his wife, Pat Holtmeyer, and at this particular point, they are just a week and a half shy of their 30-year wedding anniversary, as well as Ernie's 58th birthday. The couple also have a 26-year-old daughter named Kelly, a college graduate who is still living at home, as well as two sons, 19-year-old Jeff, who has just started his freshman year at university, and 17-year-old Zach, who is attending high school. Ernie is currently a civil litigator who represents insurance companies and specializes in defending his clients in personal injury cases. For the past 3 years, he has been employed by the law firm Boggs Bates, which was founded in 1999 by a married couple named Darren and Beth Boggs, as well as another attorney named Mark Bates. Beth Boggs functions as the firm's managing partner, and Ernie was also made a partner shortly after he was hired. The firm is located in downtown Clayton, which is known as the St. Louis Business Park, and their offices are housed on the 3rd and 4th floors of the 4-story Guild building on Bonham Avenue. Boggs Bates has a roster of 23 lawyers, and Ernie's daughter Kelly has even worked there in the billing department. On the evening of December the 19th, Ernie was working late at the firm, but shortly before 7 p.m., a janitor discovered him on the floor in one of the 3rd-floor offices. Ernie was lying on his stomach with his head and shoulders under a desk, and his legs were extended out in full view. The janitor immediately went to fetch an attorney who worked at a different firm on the 2nd floor, and when he went to the office and noticed a small amount of blood, the attorney called 911. After paramedics and the Clayton Police Department arrived at the scene, Ernie was pronounced dead. At the outset, everyone assumed that Ernie had suffered some sort of fatal medical issue, and when his family was notified about his death, they were initially told that he succumbed to a heart attack. Even though traces of blood had been found in the office, it was assumed to be the result of Ernie striking his head. However, 3 hours after Ernie was found, the St. Louis County Chief Medical Examiner finally looked at his body and discovered what appeared to be a small wound behind his left ear, which had been obscured by his hair. The wound was about 3 millimeters wide, and after an X-ray was performed on Ernie's head, it turned out there was a bullet lodged in his brain, officially confirming that he was the victim of a homicide. The crime left everyone perplexed, because Ernie was universally regarded to be a good person by virtually everyone who knew him, and he was not known to have any enemies or issues in his marriage or private life. An extensive check was performed into Ernie's background and all of the legal cases he had worked on, but this failed to shed any light on a potential motive for his murder. There did not appear to be any signs of struggle or forced entry at the Guild building, and since Ernie was still carrying his wallet and nothing was missing from the office, robbery did not appear to be the motive for the crime. At the time of his death, Ernie was the only person working on the 3rd floor, and the last co-worker who saw him before they left was another attorney from Boggs Bates named Vince Venker. A criminal defense attorney from the law firm on the 2nd floor claimed he had been meeting with a client until around 6:30, but even though he did not personally see Ernie before he left, he did not report hearing anything unusual from above. Since the Clayton Police Department did not have a lot of experience with murders, they sought the assistance of the Major Case Squad of Greater St. Louis, which consisted of around 24 detectives from various departments throughout the area. But the squad only worked on the case for about a week before they handed it back to the Clayton PD. An anonymous donor put up a $50,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Ernie's killer, though it wound up expiring on the 1st anniversary of the crime. One of the most curious aspects of the murder is that Ernie was not found dead inside his own office, but rather another office located one door down, which belonged to a co-worker named Dan Bennett, who had been on a leave of absence since September. Ernie had also been using the computer in Dan's office, but it's been reported that the firm was upgrading its computer system at that time, so it wasn't uncommon for other employees to use Dan's computer to access the company network since his office was vacant. Dan had reportedly become burned out at his job, and prior to going on leave, he could often be seen pacing around the parking lot and screaming into his cell phone. Dan had traveled to Costa Rica with his son to look into the possibility of opening a bar there, but while he was gone, his wife filed for a legal separation from him. And even though Dan had been scheduled to return to work at the firm in mid-December, shortly before Ernie's murder, he never showed up. Rumors started circulating that Dan had developed a gambling addiction and owed money to some dangerous people, so one theory which was pushed forward is that someone went to Dan's office to kill him, but Ernie wound up being shot instead because he happened to be there and was the victim of mistaken identity. After the new year, Dan finally returned from his trip to Costa Rica and was questioned by investigators, but he denied having any gambling debts, a claim which was supported by his wife. He also maintained that his life was not in danger and said he had no knowledge of Ernie's murder. Dan soon left Boggs Bates and started working at another law firm in downtown St. Louis, and since he became separated from his wife, he moved into an apartment on West Courtois Street. Dan became a regular patron at a St. Louis sports bar, but on September the 20th, 2007, after he had failed to show up there for several days, one of the other patrons became concerned enough to check his apartment and was shocked to discover his dead body. It was estimated that Dan had been dead for 5 days before he was found, and since he was only 48 years old, the whole thing was initially considered to be suspicious, and there was speculation that his death might be connected to Ernie's murder. However, when Dan was found, his apartment had been locked from the inside with a deadbolt, and there was no sign of any intruders having been present. The medical examiner ultimately concluded that Dan's cause of death was hypertensive heart disease, and there was no foul play involved. But oddly enough, it would be less than 1 year later when another attorney from Boggs Bates suffered a similar fate. Vince Venker, the last known employee to have seen Ernie prior to his murder, also wound up leaving the firm and got divorced from his wife a few months after the crime. On August the 10th, 2008, after Vince repeatedly failed to answer his cell phone, one of his friends paid a visit to his home in St. Louis and discovered Vince dead in his bed. He was only 51 years old at the time, but much like Dan Bennett, Vince's death was determined to be the result of a heart condition, and there were no signs of foul play. At the outset of the investigation, the first name who was pushed forward as a potential suspect was Nancy Quackenbush, a former employee who had been fired by Boggs Bates in October of 2006, 2 months before Ernie's murder. In fact, detectives would show up at Nancy's residence to question her during the early morning hours of December the 20th, almost immediately after Ernie's death was determined to be a homicide. Nancy had been close friends with Ernie during her time at the firm, and claimed they took long walks together during their lunch hour, as she told investigators, quote, "I love that man." When Nancy was asked if she had been conducting a secret affair with Ernie, she denied the allegations. She also maintained that she had an alibi and was out shopping during the time period that Ernie was killed, and even provided receipts to back up her story. While it does not appear that Nancy was ever considered to be a serious suspect in the murder, there was speculation that she might have been the source of some additional drama involving the firm. Shortly after Nancy was fired, one of the firm's partners, Beth Boggs, started receiving complaints from her insurance company clients, as some of them had started receiving anonymous letters which accused the firm of billing fraud and alleged that Beth was logging in as many as 400 hours of work with them per month. In fact, the day after Ernie's murder, the Office of Chief Disciplinary Counsel in Jefferson City notified Beth that they had received their own anonymous letter containing these allegations. Beth always suspected that Nancy was the source of these letters and sent them as revenge for being fired, but Nancy denied this, and Ernie's family began to wonder if he could have been the anonymous author. I mentioned earlier that Ernie's daughter Kelly had worked at Boggs Bates, and since this was during a time period when the company was figuring out how to transition to digital, one of her duties involved setting up an online billing system for them and going through each of their invoices to ensure they were submitted to online portals. Some of these invoices were years old, and Kelly said that she once approached her father and asked, quote, "How can they miss on this much money and run a firm this large?" Ernie's family have always maintained that if he uncovered evidence of illegal or unethical activity at the firm, he likely would have taken action, and his mood reportedly changed during the last months of his life. According to his wife Pat, quote, "Towards the end of his life, he was very quiet. I regret it every day. Why didn't I ask him more? But Ernie kind of kept things close to his chest. He didn't share everything. Maybe he just didn't want to bring that bad stuff home. I look back now and thank God he was under so much stress at that crazy office." End quote. Pat also claimed that she paid a visit to Ernie's office following his murder, but was mortified to discover that Beth had converted it into a storage space for shoes for a charity she was involved in that provided footwear for needy children. An ethics complaint was filed against Boggs, Bates with the Office of Chief Disciplinary Counsel over the allegations of billing fraud, and the Regional Disciplinary Committee met up to discuss the situation. On March 17, 2008, they sent Beth a letter of admonition after concluding that she had violated a portion of the rules of professional conduct in regards to her billing practices, as she had billed clients under her name for work that was actually done by other attorneys at the firm. But there was no evidence to indicate that Boggs, Bates had engaged in widespread fraud or that these billing issues had any connection to Ernie's murder. However, this would not be the end of the drama involving Beth Boggs. By 2010, one of the firm's founding partners, Mark Bates, had left and joined another law firm, so Boggs, Bates was renamed Boggs, Avellino, Locke, and Boggs. Well, at around 1 a.m. on October the 1st of that year, Beth and her husband, Darren Boggs, were sleeping at their house when they were suddenly awakened by some explosions after a pair of small pipe bombs went off. One of the bombs had been planted in their driveway, while the other was near their back porch, and the explosions wound up shattering some windows and damaging the house and the Boggs' car. While the couple were not seriously injured, Beth did get some cuts on her hands from broken glass and said that when she stepped outside, the concrete porch was so hot that it burned her bare feet. 2 cans of lacquer thinner were found on the property, as the perpetrator had likely doused the exterior of the house with it before setting off the bombs in hopes that it would cause it to burn faster. Well, right from the outset, Beth and Darren suspected that the bombs had been set off by their former law partner, Mark Bates, who had departed their firm in April of 2008. While Bates claimed this came about after months of unsuccessful negotiations to buy Beth's interest in the firm, she alleged that Bates had been caught forging documents and stealing from them. A federal investigation was launched into the bombing, and the Boggses filed an order of protection against Bates. A hearing about the matter was held in St. Louis County Court in January of 2011, and while Bates maintained that he held no ill will towards the Boggses, he invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege and declined to answer some of the questions he was asked, such as if he was involved in the bombing or driven by the Boggs residents prior to the blast. In spite of this, the judge denied the Boggs' request to issue an order of protection against Bates, as he felt the case did not meet the legal requirements for it. Well, in September of 2012, the Boggses filed a lawsuit against Bates for property damage, battery, assault, and emotional distress. During the investigation, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had uncovered surveillance footage of Bates purchasing some items at a Home Depot in Ferguson on September the 24th, 2010, just 1 week before the bombing. Bates was shown buying lacquer thinner, a pipe, and some end caps, materials which could have been used to make the pipe bombs, but while this was not considered to be strong enough evidence to file criminal charges, the Boggses still elected to file a lawsuit against Bates since the 2-year statute of limitations in civil court was about to expire. In addition to Bates, the suit named a second defendant, known only as Adam Doe, as the Boggses believes that Bates had an accomplice who assisted him with setting off the bombs. In November of that year, Bates responded by filing a countersuit against Beth for $25,000 in damages for tortious interference with business expectations and defamation. He claimed that back in 2010, shortly after the bombing took place, Beth had told a number of his clients and co-workers at the law firm where he worked that he was suspected of the bombing at their house, and she was going to place his name on a suspect list she submitted to law enforcement. In fact, she supposedly made a number of other accusations against Bates which he maintained were untrue, including that he was responsible for the murder of Ernie Brasier. Bates alleged that this led to him being terminated from his place of employment and did considerable damage to his personal and professional reputation. In June of 2013, Bates and the Boggses reached a settlement with their respective lawsuits, though the actual terms were never disclosed publicly, and it sounds like the federal investigation into the bombing came to a dead halt, as no one was ever charged with that crime. While Boggs, Avellino, Locke, and Boggs is still in operation today, the firm has since relocated from Clayton to the suburb of Olivet, and Darren Boggs passed away on September the 30th, 2022, at the age of 57. While it's unclear if all this additional drama was connected to Ernie's murder, it prompted his widow Pat to say, quote, "There's something crazy going on at that law firm. It's almost like a John Grisham novel," end quote. In recent years, both Pat and Kelly have not hesitated to express their belief that Vince Vanker was responsible for Ernie's murder. In addition to being the last known employee to see Ernie alive, Vince came under suspicion because he happened to own a Buffalo Scout .22 caliber pistol. While the authorities have never publicly confirmed what caliber of bullet was found in Ernie's head, Vince's gun looked like it could have been small enough to create the 3mm wound. When Vince was questioned, he claimed that he often liked to go out into the backyard and fire off this pistol with one of his neighbors, yet when this neighbor was interviewed, he denied that he and Vince had ever shot guns together. Ballistics testing was performed on Vince's gun, but the results were inconclusive, and it could not be established as the murder weapon. As far as motive goes, Vince was known for having a drinking problem, and Ernie had reportedly confronted him about showing up to work with a noticeable smell of alcohol on his breath. There was also an additional incident where Ernie walked in on Vince shaving his face in the firm's bathroom sink, and he expressed his belief to Kelly that this was unprofessional behavior. Prior to Ernie's death, he and Vince had been competing to take on the account of a potentially important new client, the Fireman's Fund Insurance Company, and whoever got it would receive a raise in pay as well as a reduced workload. In recent years, Ernie had been forced to accumulate 50 hours of billable work each week or risk a pay cut, but the week before he was killed, Ernie informed Pat that he had been awarded the Fireman's Fund account, which meant he would no longer have to overwork himself to reach the 50 weekly hours. At the time, Vince was on the verge of receiving a divorce from his wife, and he was paranoid about losing his job, so Ernie's family have speculated that not receiving the Fireman's Fund account could have been the breaking point which caused Vince to snap and commit murder. At one point, Vince agreed to the police's request to take a computer voice stress analyzer test, but he declined to do so a second time, and the results of this test have never been released publicly. In the end, no evidence was found to implicate Vince before he died in 2008, and while Ernie's family have publicly expressed their suspicions about him, law enforcement has never named Vince as a suspect or a person of interest. So after 2 decades, the murder of Ernie Brasier still continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So yes, Ernie Brasier's widow was not kidding when she said that the firm Boggs, Bates, now known as Boggs, Avellino, Locke & Boggs, seemed like something out of a John Grisham novel. But the truly ironic thing is that they mostly handled defending insurance companies in personal injury and workers' compensation cases, which is not exactly a field where you would expect to find a lot of drama and intrigue. One of John Grisham's biggest hit novels, The Firm, covered the story of a law firm which was a white-collar front for the mafia, but since Boggs, Avellino, Locke, and Boggs is still an active practicing law firm today, it should be clarified that even though one of their employees was murdered in their offices, there is no conclusive evidence that the firm itself has ever been embroiled in anything illegal. Though, interestingly enough, there were allegations that one of the firm's partners, Beth Boggs, had engaged in unethical conduct with her billing practices, and in the 1993 film adaptation of John Grisham's The Firm, Tom Cruise's protagonist manages to bring the fictional firm down by uncovering evidence of widespread illegal overbilling. I think it's relevant to bring this up because one of the most prominent theories in this case is that Ernie Brasier could have been killed because he uncovered incriminating and illegal activity at his place of employment, but if that were true, the firm has managed to keep everything successfully concealed for the past 2 decades. Regardless, it sounds like there was a lot of drama surrounding this place, though I have no idea how much of it was connected to Ernie's death. I'm always perturbed by cold cases in which victims are murdered in a manner which seems to resemble a professional hit, yet nothing is found in their background to shed any light on why someone would want them dead. I know it's standard practice for true crime media to paint victims in the best possible light, but virtually everyone who knew Ernie Brasier has described him as an all-around great guy, and if he had any dark secrets or skeletons in his closet, investigators have failed to uncover them. Now, if Ernie's murder had occurred outdoors in a public place or something, you could possibly classify his death as some sort of random crime committed by an individual who simply wanted to kill someone. But Ernie was killed in an office on the 3rd floor of a downtown office building, and even though the crime took place after hours, when most of the other employees had left, whoever did this took a huge risk of being seen. A number of other people who worked in the building pointed out that if someone targeted Ernie, it would have been a lot simpler to shoot him in the parking lot while he was leaving, rather than going inside and traveling up 3 floors. So in recent years, Ernie's widow Pat and his daughter Kelly have not hesitated to express their opinion that one of Ernie's co-workers, Vince Venker, was responsible for his murder, even though he has never formally been named as a suspect or person of interest by law enforcement. I'm not sure if Pat and Kelly would be so open about this if Vince was still alive, but in retrospect, Pat made a rather cryptic comment to the media after Vince died in 2008. She had originally said that she wasn't planning to hire private investigators because she was confident that the Clayton PD would solve her husband's case on their own, but following Vince's death, she stated, quote, "Who is going to figure this out? There is an undying need to know to get to the bottom of this. It just seems to be going nowhere," end quote. I'm guessing that Pat always had her suspicions about Vince, but after he passed away, she felt it would be difficult to conclusively prove his involvement and solve the case. Of course, we've seen a number of cold cases get solved in recent years after genetic genealogy posthumously linked DNA evidence to a deceased suspect, but I'm not sure if that's an option in a case like this, where the victim was shot and there might not be any DNA. Kelly has complained that since her father's death was initially believed to be a heart attack, the crime scene may have been contaminated and potentially important evidence was damaged, which could be a reason why no murder charges were ever filed, though the Clayton Police Department have always denied this. But even if by chance Vince's DNA was found at the murder scene, that wouldn't necessarily prove anything since he worked in that building and could have left his DNA in the office for innocent reasons on a prior occasion. We'll talk more about the possibility of Vince being the killer later on, but let's go back to the very beginning. The official story is that by the time Ernie was killed, everyone else who worked for Boggs, and Bates had gone home for the night, and Ernie was working alone. It's been reported that Vince was the last eyewitness to see Ernie alive before his body was found shortly before 7 p.m. There were other employees working at a firm just below on the 2nd floor, but they didn't report seeing or hearing anything unusual that night. Given that there was no sign of any struggle, and Ernie was likely killed with a small caliber gun, the murder may not have made enough noise to attract anyone's attention. The fact that the gunshot wound was behind Ernie's left ear, and he was lying on his stomach with his head and shoulders beneath a desk and his legs sticking out, might indicate that he was taken by complete surprise by the killer. And since nothing was stolen from Ernie or the office, robbery was obviously not the motive, and whoever did this had one singular purpose, and that was to commit murder. At first glance, I found it very odd that Ernie was not inside his own office, but rather an office belonging to Dan Bennett, a co-worker who had gone on a leave of absence to Costa Rica 3 months earlier and did not return as scheduled in mid-December, which would have been right before this crime took place. Given the circumstances, I can see why people speculated that Dan was the intended target and Ernie was the victim of mistaken identity, but once I learned that the firm's computer system was being upgraded and it was common practice for other employees to use the computer in Dan's office to log onto the network, Ernie's presence in there suddenly didn't seem so unusual. If Ernie was the intended target all along, then it's probably only a coincidence that he happened to be in Dan's office at the time he was killed, particularly since his own office was only 1 door down. It really sounds like Dan's personal life was in turmoil at this time, which is probably what led to the rumors that he had a gambling problem and Ernie was murdered by someone over Dan's debts. However, both Dan and his wife denied that he had any gambling issues, and given that she had just filed for separation from him, I see no reason for Dan's wife to lie about this. Besides, if someone really wanted to go after Dan over a gambling debt, it really makes no sense to do so at his workplace. Not only was it a huge risk to go up to Dan's third-floor office, but this was between 6:30 and 7 p.m. after all the employees would have normally gone home, so what reason would they have to believe that Dan was even there at that time? Obviously, since it sounds like Dan was still in Costa Rica on this particular date, I'm guessing that he had an airtight alibi clearing him of any direct involvement in the murder, but I think the main reason that the mistaken identity theory picked up some additional steam is because Dan himself wound up dead only 9 months later. To recap, Dan died of hypertensive heart disease at the age of 48 in September of 2007, and Vince Vetter succumbed to a fatal heart condition at the age of 51 in August of 2008. If that wasn't enough, another former Boggs Bates employee named Wade Thomas, who worked at the firm from 2005 until 2008, died from cardiac arrest at the age of 39 on New Year's Day in 2012. I've never seen Thomas get mentioned in conjunction with this case, but what are the odds that 3 separate employees from the same firm would succumb to heart issues at relatively young ages in the years after they left? One of the firm's founding partners, Darren Boggs, also passed away in September of 2022, and while no details have been publicly released about his cause of death, he was only 57 years old. When you include Ernie's murder, that's 4 employees from the same firm in a relatively mid-sized town, all dying before the age of 60 during one 16-year span. I guess I can see why people would be having flashbacks to John Grisham's The Firm, since its plot involved a number of employees from the same firm winding up dead under suspicious circumstances. But other than Ernie's murder, there is zero evidence to indicate foul play in the deaths of any of these people from Boggs, and Bates, and I think the whole situation is nothing more than a tragic coincidence. Another employee from the firm that popped up on the radar as a potential suspect was an individual who has one of the greatest names of anyone ever featured on this podcast, Nancy Quackenbush. She was fired 2 months before Ernie's murder, and while there doesn't seem to be any details out there about why, Nancy claimed that she had a very close relationship with Ernie. Naturally, this caused suspicion that they might have been conducting a secret affair, providing a potential motive for murder, but no evidence was ever found to support this, and everyone who knew Ernie vouched for his character and maintained that he was not the type of person who ever would have cheated on his wife. It sounds like Nancy was able to provide receipts which showed that she was shopping during the time period of the murder, and while I don't believe law enforcement ever officially stated that she had been cleared as a suspect, I sense that she's no longer the focal point of the investigation. However, the big unanswered question with Nancy is whether or not she was responsible for sending out a series of anonymous letters which accused Beth Boggs and the firm of committing billing fraud. Nancy always denied this, but Ernie's family have not discounted the possibility that he could have been the anonymous author if he had uncovered evidence of fraudulent activity. And if that were the case, could this have caused things to escalate into murder? Well, Beth Boggs was the firm's managing partner, and it does not sound like she was the most popular boss in the world, as she had very strict policies, such as requiring her employees to sign in when they arrived at work and sign out when they left to ensure that they had worked a full day. She also made sure to review all of her attorney's correspondence before the secretary sent it out on letterhead and would not allow her employees to have individual email accounts. During one interview, Pat stated, quote, "She ruled that place. She was dealing with attorneys, but treated them like children," end quote. Ernie's daughter Kelly has also complained that Beth made the investigation into her father's murder more difficult as she hired a criminal defense attorney and would not allow any of the firm's employees to speak with law enforcement without his representation. Kelly stated, quote, "Beth Boggs avoided a PR nightmare, but is she guilty? Only her, God, and Vince know what's up," end quote. Well, on its own, I don't find anything inherently suspicious about the fact that Beth did not want any of her employees to speak with the police without the presence of a criminal defense attorney because, well, any good lawyer will advise you not to speak with law enforcement without one. Ernie was literally murdered inside the firm's offices, so even if no one associated with them had any direct involvement, I can see them being extra cautious with how they handled the situation. In regards to this whole saga involving billing practices, it sounds like the worst thing that Beth was caught doing was billing clients under her name for work done by other attorneys. While that was definitely unethical, it's still a far cry from doing something like, say, committing billing fraud in order to embezzle money, and the only punishment Beth received was a letter of admonition from the Office of Chief Disciplinary Counsel. I have no idea if Ernie ever found out about these practices, but I'm not sure it would have been serious enough for anyone to kill him to cover it up. And even so, would Beth really be brazen enough to shoot Ernie inside her own law firm and bring them a lot of unwanted attention? From what I've heard about his personality, if Ernie had concerns about what Beth was doing, he sounds like someone who would have spoken to her face-to-face about it rather than sending out anonymous letters. After all, some of these letters were sent out to the firm's clients, which could have jeopardized Ernie's working relationship with them, so this definitely seems like the type of action you would suspect from a disgruntled former employee who wanted revenge for getting fired. Now, what's interesting is that even though fingers have been pointed at a number of different employees from Boggs, and Bates, one person who was never named as a potential suspect was Mark Bates, who left the firm just over a year and a half later on what were described as bad terms, and he would then be accused of setting off a pair of pipe bombs outside the Boggs' residence. I have no idea what kind of relationship Ernie had with Mark Bates, though Ernie did wind up becoming a partner at the firm not long after he was hired. It's possible that this whole bombing has no connection to the murder, but it once again harkens the question of what the hell was going on at that firm to lead to so many bizarre events during a window of just a couple of years. So according to the Boggses, when Bates left the firm in 2008, he was caught forging documents and stealing, but if these allegations are true, then it appears they elected not to file charges or formally terminate his employment. While I can understand Bates holding a grudge against the Boggses, he did find employment at another firm, and the bombing did not take place until 2.5 years later, so it makes you wonder why he would feel compelled to do something like this after all that time, unless there was more animosity in the relationship that we don't know about. Even though the explosions caused some damage to the house and left the Boggses with only minor injuries, so it makes me wonder if the bomber was always intending to kill them or just elected to set them off for the express purpose of scaring them. I don't want to directly accuse Bates of doing this, but the fact that there was surveillance footage of him at Home Depot 1 week earlier buying materials which could be used to build a pipe bomb seems like way too much of a coincidence, though the federal authorities apparently felt it wasn't strong enough evidence to file charges. The whole thing is a fairly compelling mystery within a mystery, though it is kind of a shame that it came to an end with both sides reaching a settlement for their separate lawsuits, because I have a ton of unanswered questions and would have loved to have learned more details if this had gone to court. For instance, when the Boggses filed their suit, they accused Bates of setting off the bombs alongside an accomplice known only as Adam Doe, so I'd really be curious to know who this guy was and why he would agree to participate in something like this. There would ordinarily be no reason to suspect that this incident has any relation to Ernie's murder, but during his countersuit, Bates alleged that Beth did serious damage to his reputation by accusing him of a number of things he did not do, such as killing Ernie Brasier. Law enforcement has never commented on this possibility, so I have to wonder, did Beth accuse Bates of this just for the purposes of trolling him and getting revenge, or did she legitimately believe that he might have been responsible for Ernie's death? I have no idea, but if Bates was conducting illegal activity during his time at the firm, I suppose he might have felt compelled to kill Ernie if he found out about it. After all, anyone brazen enough to set off pipe bombs outside someone's house is also capable of taking the extreme step of shooting a fellow employee to death inside their own workplace. However, I don't know if Bates had an alibi or if his whereabouts could be accounted for on the night of Ernie's murder, so all this speculation about his involvement may be a waste of time. All that being said, I certainly don't think it's unreasonable to assume that Ernie could have been killed by a fellow coworker who worked at the firm. Even though it seems incredibly risky for an outsider to enter a downtown office building and travel up 3 floors to kill someone, it would be less of a risk if they were already in the building to begin with and left after committing the crime. I haven't heard any reporting about if there were security cameras inside or outside the guild building, but I think it's reasonable to assume that if a camera had captured footage of any suspicious-looking individuals entering or exiting around the time of Ernie's murder, that information would have been released publicly. However, if the killer was someone who worked there and was already on the 3rd floor when they killed Ernie, then it wouldn't be out of the ordinary if a camera captured them leaving. And that leads us back to Vince Venker, whom Ernie's family believe is the most likely suspect. Ernie's body was found just before 7 p.m., and Vince was supposedly the last person to see him alive, but since the exact time when Vince is alleged to have led the office has never been shared publicly, I have no idea what kind of time frame there would have been for someone else to enter the office and kill Ernie after Vince was gone. Vince owned a Buffalo Scout .22 caliber pistol, which could have been small enough to be the murder weapon, and he also shared an odd story about firing off this gun in his backyard with a neighbor, who in turn denied that they had ever fired guns together at all. It's been reported that ballistics tests performed on this gun were inconclusive, which I find interesting, since that could have definitively proven Vince's involvement in the crime. But in Vince's defense, if that gun really was the murder weapon, you would think he would have gotten rid of it before the police had the opportunity to get their hands on it. In regards to potential motive, it sounds like Vince had a number of personal issues during this time period, as his wife was about to divorce him and he had a drinking problem, and Ernie apparently confronted him about the fact that he would show up to work with the smell of alcohol on his breath. But most importantly, Ernie and Vince were both competing for an important new account, which would mean a bump in pay and a lighter workload, and Ernie was awarded this account the week before he was killed. In addition to possible jealousy and resentment over this, it sounds like Vince was also paranoid he was going to lose his job, so I would not be surprised if not getting the account could have been the breaking point which prompted him to commit murder. It's possible the whole thing wasn't even a pre-planned crime, as perhaps the two men had a heated argument which escalated into violence, but then again, why would Vince even be carrying a pistol like that on him at his place of employment unless he had been planning to use it? If Vince is guilty, then this might explain why he succumbed to a fatal heart attack at the age of 51 less than 2 years later, as in addition to his personal problems and his alleged issues with alcoholism, I'm sure that being a potential suspect in a murder would have caused an incredible amount of stress. But I should once again reiterate that the sole source of these accusations against Vince is Ernie's family, as law enforcement has never named him as a suspect or person of interest. And even though he has been deceased for 17 years, investigators may not want to potentially smear his reputation unless they have definitive evidence. Overall, I do think that Vince being the perpetrator is the scenario which makes the most sense, but I wouldn't say I'm 100% on it, and there could definitely still be a piece of the puzzle missing which we've overlooked. Perhaps Ernie really was the victim of mistaken identity and was killed by someone he had no connection to. Or alternatively, maybe there was something in Ernie's background which drove someone to murder him, but it's been completely overlooked, and all this other drama surrounding the firm is nothing but smoke and mirrors. Like I mentioned earlier, if Vince Venker was the killer, it might be difficult to conclusively prove it after all these years, but maybe there is someone out there who knows something. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Ernie Brasier, please contact the Clayton Police Department at 314-645-3000. That's 314-645-3000. Or you can also contact the St. Louis Regional Crime Stoppers at 1-866-371-TIPS. That's 1-866-371-8477. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the bizarre and baffling 2001 murder of real estate agent Mike Emmert, which is technically considered to be solved, but still has a bunch of unanswered questions. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 2001 disappearance and murder of Margie Dabney, an elderly woman who somehow went missing from an airport. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 80 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Lauren Y., J.L. Draw, Lori M., and Lispy L. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board, at the Sitcoms Online forum, and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. Anyway, you've probably noticed that we're currently in the month of October, and per tradition, we're going to spend the next 3 weeks counting down to October the 31st by releasing a series of Halloween-themed episodes. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for this year's first Halloween episode of The Trail Went Cold.